Today's topic is value propositions and pricing, and we're moving into the second half of the course as I'll describe shortly. So what we have done so far, we have done basically the first half of the course with understanding the market. We did an introduction and overview of marketing. We talked about marketing strategy, the important central role of customers and value, market analysis techniques, and then demand forecasting and technology forecasting last time. Now we're moving into going from what I would call incoming information, understanding the market, to outgoing information, how we can now shape the market and allow our products and services to make an impact in that market. And so the first part of that is to understand value propositions and pricing. And that will be the topic for today. So we'll do a very quick review from the last lecture about technology and demand forecasting, talk about planning under uncertainty, technology forecasting, demand forecasting, and a little bit about predicting technological progress. So there are three major areas of forecasting, as we discussed. There's economic forecasting, the large-scale general business conditions, gross national product, tax policy, employment, and so forth. That also has particular challenges as well. Then we have technology forecasting, which is predicting the probability and possible future developments in technology or services related to that. That will impact on the marketing strategy and the firm's strategy as a whole. And then, of course, there's demand forecasting, which predicts the quantity and timing of demand for the products and services. So they're slightly different, of course, or quite different: economic forecasting, technology forecasting, and demand forecasting. And then we discussed when it comes to forecasting in general, but specifically for this purpose, technology forecasting, there are roughly two types of methods. There are the qualitative exploratory methods, and then there are the quantitative normative methods. And there are also mixed methods. So the exploratory methods include, the qualitative methods include technology monitoring, trend analysis, scenario analysis, the expert opinion polling, the Delphi technique, which is a technique of successive iterative expert polling. And then on the quantitative methods, there are various statistical and time series methods and dynamical modeling. We talked about a specific dynamical modeling system that I had actually developed in the lecture. Another very important aspect of technology forecasting is that these smooth changes, for example, the number of memory density going up in a certain way, or the number of transistors on a chip in the sense of Moore's law, these gradual, well, they may be rapid, but these monotonic changes can also be interrupted by discontinuities. In other words, ways that technology suddenly shifts into new paradigms. And this typically underlies a disruptive change in the market, which is, of course, very important for marketing, very important for corporate strategy. So technology discontinuities are a shift in the type of technology, so the performance does not improve in some incremental way, but in a discontinuous way. The example of incandescent lamps versus fluorescent lamps, and then LEDs and so forth. So in demand forecasting, we had, again, the qualitative and the quantitative. We had internal versus external. So we look at the market, or we look at the economic aspect from externally, how that influences demand. So that's a brief overview of the last time's lecture. And now let's proceed to value propositions and pricing. Any questions? You can also type in the chat room. Okay, let's continue. Value propositions and pricing. So we're going to do an overview of pricing. We're going to talk about value propositions, pricing strategies, and tactics. So 3 things. So early on in the course, we talked about the 4 Ps, the so-called marketing mix, and these include price. Pricing is one of the key elements, of course. Setting the price of a product is, of course, very important. The 4 Ps being product, price, promotion, and place. So we will discuss each of these in the course of the next few lectures, but now today we focus on price. So it's obviously the process by which a business sets the price of its products and services. It's one of the 4 Ps, as we mentioned, of the marketing mix. It is distinct from the other 3 elements, is that price is the only revenue generating element among the 4 Ps. So product development costs money, so it's a cost center. Promotion or advertising in various ways also costs money. And where we position it in the partnerships and relationships to deliver the product or service typically also costs money. So obviously all 4 of these will ultimately contribute to the firm's revenue, but price is the one that's directly revenue generating. So it's of course very important. So I wanted to have a little discussion. What is the difference between price and value? Why don't you type in the chat room some of your thoughts? What is the difference between price and value? So what is the difference between price and value? So this is a very complex question. Obviously, they seem similar. Warren Buffett, the famous investor with Berkshire Hathaway, has been quoted to say, price is what you pay, value is what you get. So let's discuss that concept in a little bit more detail. Hans Peter had mentioned in his answer to the discussion question that value is the what the consumer feels, and the price is the charge for that. So this is a very close answer to that. But one of the things that's very interesting is price is not the same as value, at least not the core value. There's additional value, if you will, that's embodied in the price. So what do we mean from that? So apart from being an exchange value, which is the monetary equivalent, the cash equivalent or whatever, the monetary equivalent of the value, the exchange value, which is close to the price. Price is also a signal. And so we talked earlier about what the customer wants. And as I mentioned, this Mercedes-Benz is not just a conveyance, a vehicle to get from point A to B. It also sends a signal. So people may pay more. In other words, they may accept a higher price because beyond the value that they get, the exchange value, in terms of the goods and the utility value, because they want to send a signal of wealth or power, prestige, or whatever. So it's interesting, when I first came to Korea 10 years ago, I had lived in the United States, and I worked in Europe as well. And of course, in the United States, some people have big trucks, but in general, there are a lot of small cars, medium-sized cars. It's not like all the cars are very big. And certainly in Europe, there are a lot of very small cars. You go in Italy, and they have those very small Fiats. And one of the reasons why in Europe is oil is expensive, gas is expensive. And so I came to Korea thinking that since Korea doesn't have oil, it has to import oil, so gas is expensive. and additionally, it's a smaller country, very dense population. I imagined that the cars would be relatively small. And that's not a remark of being a poor or rich country. This is about the utility or functionality, the functional value of the car. Why do you have a big car if it's difficult to park, it's difficult to drive, it's expensive with gas? Doesn't make a lot of sense. So you get a small car. Of course, there is aspects of a large family, or you have a small business, so you might need something bigger, and so on and so forth. But in general, it would seem to me that the value of a smaller car would be uh, more appropriate for these circumstances. But when I first came to Korea, I noticed that all the cars were, many of the cars were quite big. And in fact, I would look at the average car in Korea was bigger than the average car in the United States. And America is famous for big cars and so forth. Uh, and I didn't do a statistical survey, but it just seemed, rather strange. Eventually, I learned that, many people buy cars in Korea, not just for practical purpose, but to show a signal to their neighbors or their family or associates of a certain level of status or wealth. So having a big car was actually, very important signal. So I'm not saying it's the same as this situation, but there's a similar concept of price sending a signal. And a larger car, indicative of a higher price and so forth, sends a certain signal. So this is a very important difference between the value, the exchange value, and pricing. And so we're going to explore these concepts because they're central to marketing in more detail in this lecture. So now let's go through an overview of pricing. How do we set the price of a product or service? Especially given in mind this concept that the price may not be necessarily the same as the value, or at least the functional value. Traditional cost-based pricing, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about competition-based pricing or competitive-based pricing. We'll talk about customer-based pricing. And finally, we'll talk about strategy-based pricing. By the way, in the discussion, Fanlu Lan said value is something intangible and money is tangible. So that's a very good answer. It's not as simple as that because value also has very tangible aspects. If you want to buy a car to go from one point to the other point, that's a tangible value, if you will, transport. So there are some overlaps, but that's a very intriguing answer. So let's continue. So we have different pricing approaches. How do we set the price of a product? The simple way is you might say, well, it costs me or costs the company a certain amount, so I will sell it for 10% more, and that will be my profit, 10%. And that's generally the simplest way. But in general, that method is not as common as you think. And there are these other methods of competition-based, customer-based, and strategy-based pricing. And they relate to the value concept. So the different pricing approaches. So the simplest one is the cost-based approach. The next one is competition-based. More complicated is customer-based. And then the next level of complication is strategy-based. So let's discuss these different pricing approaches. Cost-based pricing, which is basically you estimate your costs to produce the product or deliver the service, and you add a certain amount to that to then give the price, a certain margin. So the advantages of the cost-based approach, as you can see listed here, it's fairly easy to calculate. By easy, one should be careful because it's not always easy to tabulate your costs specific to that product. Obviously, the cost of materials and goods related to that product can be fairly easy to estimate, but for a larger company, you have a finance department, you have a human resources department, you have various other functions, you may have anticipated taxes and so forth, and specifically calculating the cost may not always be so easy, but in general, it's easy to calculate. And a little bit more difficult for services. And if you do price it this way and you calculate the cost correctly, then you avoid the loss on your sales. Your price is higher than your cost. So if you calculate correctly, then you will not lose, at least on that sale. Of course, if you don't sell anything because certain aspects of the price not being appealing to the market, that's another issue. But provided you sell that product, you will avoid a loss. The cons or negatives of the cost-based approach is it's only based on the cost of the product. It is not leveraging the knowledge of the customer. So for example, if you're selling the Mercedes-Benz at cost plus a certain small percentage, the customer is buying the Mercedes-Benz not because it costs a certain amount to put all that together, but they're buying it to give a signal that they paid a lot for a car. So if your price is much lower than what the consumer is expecting or actually wants from that car, then you will lose a lot of profit. And so it doesn't include any information about the customer and their expectations of the price. Also, it doesn't relate to any information about the knowledge of the competitors, and it doesn't maximize your profit. So yes, you don't lose anything, but if you could charge more for that product, then you lose money from that. So the competition-based approach is also easy to estimate, and I would argue it's even easier than the cost basis. Well, it's not always easy, but if you do research, go to the stores, see what your competitors are selling for, and then you mark your price according to that, either lower or higher or whatever, then that's fairly straightforward. So that's called competition or competitive-based pricing. So this actually sets more competitive prices. But again, the negative of this is it doesn't leverage information about the customer, doesn't maximize profit. The value-based or customer-based, and this is where price gets closer to the value, that's why I said these are different, maximize the profit, but the challenge to that, it can be very complex. It requires a lot of information about the market and information about the customer. So the first half of the course that we talked about customers and value and the market analysis, those aspects have to be very important and take a lot of effort to then feed into this customer-based pricing. So traditional cost-based pricing, you take the product, you estimate the cost, you then charge the price, and that's delivered to the customers. So cost plus pricing is adding a standard markup. It ignores the demand and competition. It's fairly simple, as I mentioned. Price competition is minimized. And one very important factor here, it's perceived as being more fair to both buyers and sellers. So this is very interesting because in Korean business, for example, there is a lot of complaints that the big companies, the chaebols, pressure the smaller companies to give very low prices in the supply chain for those bigger companies. And that has created a big issue on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, that they can't invest, that they can't grow, and the economy is dominated by the chaebols. The prices are kept low because the accepted paradigm is cost-based pricing for various suppliers to the chaebols. Now, it's interesting. There are two aspects to this. So let's say you're a supplier and you're providing some component to the chaebol, and they say, we're going to give you 5% more than your cost. And there are two challenges. One is if you say, I want to charge more because I know this is more valuable to you, then there are competitors potentially, and you will lose that business. The second, more powerful reason is that it's regarded as being more fair. So if you want to get more money and extract more value as it is, that is considered in some ways to be unfair. So the chaebol might answer, well, you're not being very fair, you're not working cooperatively, and so on and so forth. So cost-based pricing has a sort of ethical advantage. And we'll talk about this concept, very importantly, some more. So the break-even pricing is setting price to break even on the cost of making and marketing the product. It's more closely related to profit. So now let's talk about competition-based pricing in a little more detail. So in competition-based pricing, you do a market analysis of the competition, and this determines the price. And this is what is given to the customer. And based on this competition-based pricing, you say, I need to have a certain cost, and that determines the product. So this is very interesting. In the simple cost-based pricing, you start out with the product, estimate the cost, deliver the price. In competition-based pricing, typically you will investigate the competition and then determine the product that will make sure that you have enough profit. In other words, it doesn't make sense to do competition-based pricing if you have a product that is much too expensive for the competition. So this raises a very interesting concept. Most people think about marketing, such as market analysis and the pricing and all that, as being after product development. And this is the typical approach in startups as well as large companies. We develop the product, which is part of marketing, but let's say we put that with the engineers and R&D. And we talked earlier about how there are some connections between R&D and marketing. But let's just say it's a separate product development department, dominated by engineers, not by marketing people. So that's product development. And then the product is made and they say, okay, now we have to market it. But if that marketing strategy is based on competition-based pricing, and they say we can sell it at this price, but the product development produced a product that was twice as expensive, that won't work. So this raises the interesting point, as I'm emphasizing, that marketing can often come before product development. That's a very strange concept. Many technology people, they may have come out of a research lab in a university, or they have a brilliant idea and so forth. They will have the product and then they say, now we're going to do the marketing. And typically marketing analysis is often on a startup pitch near the end. But imagine if you were a company that started out with a market analysis and then said, we are going to make this product for that market. as opposed to starting with the product. So this is an extremely important concept, and we talked in the beginning of the class about the importance of marketing class, and this is a principles of marketing class, of course, and that it was a very important class. In fact, it's the central class for business. If you don't establish a market, things like finance, accounting, and management and human resources and all these things are won't work. And establishing the market and selling the product based on that marketing is very central. So marketing in many senses comes first, and even pricing. So let's go to customer-based pricing. So this is among the most complex of pricing. We start with the customer. So we do some market analysis, either top-down or bottom-up, as we described in the previous lecture. We try to understand what the value is to the customer. Do they want a expensive-looking car? Do they want a big car? Do they want a small car, energy efficient? Do they want a cheaper car? What is the value to the customer? And that whole lecture we did on customer and value and defining a customer and defining value is very central to this. So we don't even know what the product will be. We focus on the customer. That value that we want to deliver, whether it be the functional value, the enhanced value, the augmented value, etc., all those concepts we talked about earlier, that will then define the product. Luxury, basic, essential, and so forth. And then from that, we get the price, which matches what the customer value is, and finally, the cost. So that is the process of doing customer-based pricing. So an example of value-based pricing is Uber, and you probably heard of, we don't have it in Korea, but you probably heard about ride sharing, of course, and the concept of surge pricing. So if during rush hour or a rainstorm or a big event or Friday night when more people need an Uber or another ride sharing service, the price will go up. In other words, based on the demand, the customer's value of that transport service is greater. And because the value is greater, and that's what the customer wants, then the pricing will increase to match that value. And the term for that, as you may know, is the surge value. So they call that value-based pricing. And remember, we said that cost-based pricing is more fair. And so there is a sort of feeling, as you can imagine, that of unfairness, if you will, that a company or whatever is taking advantage of my extra need. It's almost as if you were a doctor in a hospital and you charge $100. Most of that may be paid by the insurance or whatever, but you charge $100 for the visit. But if the person, is worried about cancer or very serious condition, and so the value of the doctor meeting is greater, and the doctor did a study and he's like looking at the patient and trying to figure out, what do they really value, and he or she gets the information that the patient is really worried about a cancer. He says, I will charge you $1,000 for this visit, because he knows that this visit is more valuable as opposed to a routine visit to the doctor. Many people would say that's unfair. Let's say the patient comes to the emergency room and they have trouble breathing because of COVID and they need a tube and the ventilator, and the doctor sees that and knows that the patient will die within 10 minutes if they don't do that tube. And he says, what is your life worth? and I'll charge you $1 million to put the tube in. Patient can't do on their own, of course. So that is not considered very fair. So there are also challenges with value-based pricing. On the other hand, if you think of this from economic theory and supply and demand and so forth, there are other societal benefits to matching supply and demand through pricing mechanisms. So it's a very complicated issue. It's not that customer-based pricing is the best always. It optimally maximizes the profit, as we mentioned, because it matches the value and the price as close as possible. But it has complications, as I mentioned. It's difficult to actually determine because we have to really understand the customers and the value. And it infringes, or I shouldn't say infringes, it conflicts potentially with ethical and moral issues of fairness. So in a way, the I wouldn't say best, but the approach that balances all these things is what we would call strategy-based pricing. And strategy-based pricing is a combination of customer-based pricing, which is to optimize the value and price, but at the same time also bring in the company strategy, the values, and the position it wants to have in the market, and not just to extract as much value as possible from the market. So strategy-based pricing is also value-based. So for example, if you're a hospital and you want to serve the society, and you also want to perhaps, obviously fit with certain government regulations, and you want to have a long-term trust with patients and your community, those are your values. You wouldn't charge $1 million to someone who's about to die just because you can, and make that profit. So that's a value-based, strategy-based pricing, which also builds on core competencies. These come together in your distinctive position, the strategy that we talked about, to then determine the price. So those are various pricing mechanisms. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll talk about value propositions. So we're going to start again with the value propositions, and we'll do an overview, talk about the value cycle, value status, innovation, and value. So what is a value proposition? Value is benefits minus costs, and the costs also include the economic risk. So we talked about next best value, and the inertia and the cost of switching costs and so forth. So also economic risk aspects. So the value proposition can be regarded as the intersection of three things: what you are offering, what the marketplace offering and how you're different than that, and what the customer needs. And so your value proposition is the intersection of your offering, what the marketplace offers, and what the customer needs. So I thought we would go through a little bit of discussion with this next question. We talk about value propositions when it comes to companies and products and services, but in many ways it relates to many things, including individuals. What is your value proposition? What do you provide something that is related to your capabilities, what the marketplace or what other people are doing, and what other people can benefit from. Now, this is not to mean one person is better than the other person, but everybody has a unique value proposition that they bring. So I thought we'd have a little bit of a discussion. It's a little bit unconventional, but talking about this concept, we can go around and get a few answers. Okay, so what is your value proposition? As I emphasize, is an important question to consider. So one way to look at this value proposition is so-called value proposition canvas or landscape. So we have the two things. We have the product, the offering, and then we have the customer. And we make a landscape or canvas of various aspects of the product and the customer as it relates to value proposition. So for example, when it comes to the product, what does your product do? What are the benefits? What about the experience? What does it feel like to use your product? And what are the features? How does your product work? Not just what it does, but what are different capabilities and features. So that's the value of the product, the offering. Then when we look at the customer, what are the wants? What do they want from a product? And then there are the hidden needs. What are the hidden needs and the rational drivers? So the wanting and the needing, might be, quite different. Somebody who has gained a lot of weight, they may want a candy, but they need to have something more healthy. And they have fears of, maybe getting heart attack or cancer from the obesity and so forth. So wants, needs, and fears, and also substitutes. That's the economic risk and the substitution we talked about. So your value proposition has to match as much of what your product offers to what the customer wants, needs, fears, in relation to the substitutes or what's in the market. So one way to understand the value proposition is to make this canvas. So when I asked the question personally, what is your personal value proposition? Most of you answered with, your features, ability, quality, efficiency, knowledge. Those are all good answers, but you were focusing on this small aspect of the value proposition canvas. Do people want quality? The simple answer might be yes. Of course, people want quality, but they may actually want quantity more. They may want price, etc. So you need to understand also what is the world out there and what they want and are expecting when you match the value proposition. So that's the value proposition canvas. Then we have the value proposition life cycle. So we create value over the life cycle. There's a value creation, value purchase, value use, value renewal, and finally value transfer. So for example, most people think of value proposition as this value use. What is the use of this product or service? But sometimes people buy things, in particular like investment, or even a car sometimes, because of the value transfer. People buy a fancy car because maybe they can sell it for more later. So the value cycle is important in the value proposition. And then very importantly, there's value status. As we mentioned with the Mercedes-Benz and other things, there are the very clear attributes that are tangible, but there's also perceptions and status. So we have the objective price, the perceived monetary risk, the perceived non-monetary price, the perceived sacrifice. This is the negative side, the cost of your product, etc. And these are the positive aspects, the extrinsic attributes, the intrinsic attributes, perceived quality. All of these come into the perceived value. And then high-level abstractions. Do I want to have big car, small car? Do I want to contribute to the environment? Do I want to be ecologically conscious? So I want to have low gas, carbon emissions, and so forth. So these are high-level abstractions. They all feed into this perceived value, the negative side, the risk, and the positive side, and ultimately the purchase decision. So value status is very important in the value proposition. So one of the last things I want to point out is the importance of innovation and value. So when we talk about value, the only true way to create new value is through innovation. So if we look at this in a very fundamental way of economics, as you know from economics, you have supply and demand curve. So supply and demand curve is at an equilibrium. So business provides a value and they set a price, as we talked about, and that's the supply, and then the demand will be a function of that price. So you increase the price, the demand goes down, decrease the price, demand goes up, and so you get an equilibrium. And of course, if you throw in many companies there, you have a market equilibrium. And mathematically, it has been shown that markets at equilibrium will minimize the profits, and eventually profits will go to zero in perfect competition. And so the goal of every company is, in a sense, as this article points out, is to defy markets. So any firm at the mercy of supply and demand and market equilibrium will eventually be unable to make an economic profit. So there are only two ways that you can defy or be away from equilibrium in the market. And the two strategies are what are called rent seeking and innovation. Rent seeking is a way of locking into a disequilibrium, for example, through a monopoly or oligopoly, through patents that maintain certain position that other people cannot come in, government regulation, government bribes, obviously illegal things, government lobbying, and so forth, or manipulating and pushing government regulation that create a rent-seeking situation. And rent-seeking sometimes is legal, of course, and sometimes it's illegal, but the point is you want to create an artificial situation away from market equilibrium so you can continue to get profits. That's rent-seeking. In the long view, whether it's legal or illegal, it's in a way detracting from value. It's keeping away from equilibrium. The second way to create value, in other words, to create profit above the economic cost, is through innovation. By innovation, you create a movement away from the market equilibrium. So innovation is more valuable, as emphasized, from rent seeking because it raises productivity of both capital and labor. So this is an innovation matrix. We have 4 different types of innovation in this sense. We can define the problem as being not well-defined and well-defined. We can describe the domain where we are as being not well-defined and very well-defined. So if the problem and the domain, the market, is very well-defined, we call these sustaining innovations. If the domain is well-defined, but the problem is not well-defined, we call this disruptive innovation. Breakthrough innovation, in terms of a totally new market, is a not well-defined domain, but a well-defined problem. And then when both of them are not well defined, we have very basic research in academic association, affiliation, academic organizations, research divisions of companies, and so forth. So breakthrough innovation, sustaining disruptive innovation, and basic research. So what are some pricing strategies and tactics? We'll talk about pricing strategies, pricing strategies matrix. So a pricing strategy, which is related to the strategy approach that we mentioned, consistent with the organization missions and values. It becomes part of a long-term strategic plan. Revenue-oriented pricing strategy in terms of maximizing profits. Operations-oriented, where the objective is to optimize the efficiency and the productive capacity. So for example, if you want to have a big market share and very big volume, so you reduce the cost, you might have an operations-oriented pricing strategy. So try to achieve a certain volume. Customer-oriented, to maximize the number of customers, different levels in the customer's ability to pay, and the value-based, as we mentioned, pricing strategies. Relationship-oriented pricing strategies, so that you might offer different prices to different groups based on relationship and existing and potential customers. So these are different pricing strategies that are used. And finally, socially oriented pricing strategy. You want to create a certain ethical or social position that accomplishes some social goals. So pricing approaches in terms of product and promotion. So pricing is not always separate from in the 4 Ps. There's a connection between pricing and how you promote a product, and pricing and the actual product. So for example, if you promote very high and you have high promotion costs and you're advertising a lot and you have a high price, we call that a rapid skimming strategy. You basically take a lot, not a lot, but you take a small amount, but very quickly, of the high price customers. Low promotion, high price would be a slow skimming strategy. But if you want to not just take a small number of customers quickly, but you want to dominate the market, we would do a lower price, and this would be a rapid penetration strategy, but the promotion costs are very high. But if the promotion costs are lower, but the price is low, we call this a slow penetration strategy. So this is the intersection of price and promotion. So the strategy is a intersection between those 2 elements of the marketing mix. Then also a product quality and price. Some of these are negative and some are positive. So a high product quality, a low price, superb value strategy. Many companies obviously like to be here. A low product quality and a high price would be an ethically dubious ripoff strategy. A high product quality and a high price would be a premium strategy. A high value strategy with the medium price. Product quality medium but high price would be an overcharging strategy. And a low price, low product quality would be an economy or price conscious strategy, etc. So this is the intersection of price and product quality. So these are strategies that integrate wider elements of the marketing mix. So pricing strategies also drive pricing tactics. So tactics would be the specific methods of pricing. So if we had that penetration pricing with high promotion and low cost, new market entry, the pricing tactic would be to keep the prices low until established in the market. If you have the skimming strategy, price skimming, then high price, then lower gradually the price over time. That's how we price skimming strategy. Promotional strategies, you keep the price low for a short spell, then return to normal. Destroyer pricing strategy, you keep the prices low, eliminate competitors, then raise the price. And this is the demand-oriented pricing that we talked about. So pricing strategies drive pricing tactics. So a whole list of pricing tactics. Some of them are not legal, but I wanted to list most of them. Most of these are, it also depends on regulations and rules and so forth. But complementary pricing, contingency pricing, differential pricing, discrete pricing, discount pricing, diversionary pricing, everyday low prices, exit fees, experience curve pricing. These are all various pricing tactics that have been utilized to implement the pricing strategy. So some of the main ones are complementary, differential, geographic pricing, different places have different prices, high-low pricing, prestige pricing we talked about, price skimming, psychological pricing. So a few closing thoughts. Profit is not something to add on at the end. It is something to plan on for in the beginning. So as I mentioned, pricing often comes at the very end. You develop a product, you develop a service, and you say, let's figure out the price. But I think a very important strategy in marketing is to begin with a price in mind and develop the product and your cost structure and your business around that. What are people paying for now for a service? Can we deliver it at a lower price, or does the market want a higher price? Is there a premium aspect to this? Is there there's more emotional aspects to this? So for a long time, people didn't pay a lot for their telephones. They were pretty standard. But then we now have $1,000 smartphones, and it becomes expected that we pay $1,000. If 20 years ago, if you were to say you're going to pay $1,000 for a phone, that would be crazy. On the other hand, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, without the internet, people paid a lot of money for phone calls. They paid 10 cents for a text message and so forth. So now pricing is actually different for some of this messaging. You don't pay anything for the messaging. You pay just for the internet service. And the messaging is included, especially if you have unlimited data and so forth. So these pricing things are not just set. They also depend on what are the societal expectations, what are the customer expectations, what does the customer value. So it's very important to build this into the beginning. So next time we're going to talk about marketing communications. I will do lecture number 7, and I will upload that, and that will be for the previous week. And actually, next week we'll do marketing communications, a very important thing. In fact, ironically, most of you at the beginning of the course would imagine that marketing was just marketing communications, advertising, promotion, etc. But you can see it's only one lecture out of many of them. And so one of the key learning points from this course is the wide expanse and wide scope of marketing. It is not just advertising. So we'll stop here and we'll have some time for some questions.